Welcome back. And just to remind you that Dr. Wu's presentation will be available online after the event. So I'd now like to introduce Dr. Ferruzzi, who's the director of the Arkansas Children's Nutrition Center and professor of developmental nutrition at the University of Arkansas. He's an expert in characterizing plant foods and explaining the functionality of their bioactive constituents. So in his presentation, we hope to learn if we need to expand the food-based dietary guidelines for flavin-3-ols or to establish a dietary recommended value, or do we need both? So over to you, Dr. Ferruzzi.
Thank you, Aideen. So hopefully today what we'll be able to talk about is build upon the great research that you've been hearing about all day and think about how this can be translated in terms of guidance for consumers in a way that's meaningful, both for products and for people. And so in that context, I just wanted to frame up where are beverages in dietary guidance here in the United States? Well, they recognize that certain beverages are important components of eating patterns by contributing total water needs, essential nutrients, and more importantly, as we think about the overall pattern of food to specific food groups, thinking of dairy and fruit in particular. They do account for 20% of total energy intake, and that is one of the reasons you see guidance in the way we do, as we'll see in a second. However, guidance on what is actually healthy in a broader sense still remains a little bit elusive. And so hopefully we'll move the needle a little bit today in that conversation. So taking you back to prior to 2020's DGA, we really looked at beverages from the context of contribution to key food groups, essential nutrients, and clear awareness for limiters. And by that, I mean calories and other dietary components which are deemed to be not so healthy. So saturated fat, for example. And with that, we get 3 recognized beverages that have part of the guidance in the DGA prior to 2020. Water, fat-free milk, and 100% fruit juice. So clearly not a great mixture of what America is drinking. So when you think about that, water, of course, number one, 50% of the population is making that as a primary beverage choice. But you do see milk and fruit beverages in there, but let's think about the broader beverage space. Tea and coffee represent almost 25% of the overall beverage choices, but there's no clear dietary guidance on these 2 critical beverages. And from all the health benefits you've heard today on tea, you would hope that there would be some guidance. However, in the current context of thinking of key essential nutrients and energy, you could see just by looking at the brewed tea composition, this coming off of the USDA's Food Data Central, that primarily what you look at when you see tea is, from a nutritional perspective, is water and some small amounts of nutrients, but nothing that is significant enough to deem it to be nutrient dense. The exception there being phenolics, which are not essential nutrients, and we'll talk more about where we want to move that conversation here in a second. So as early as 2006, there was clearly an awareness that, hey, maybe we need to expand beyond 3 beverages: water, low-fat milk, and 100% juice. And we started thinking about how that might look. And a group led by Barry Popkin and Walt Willett had proposed a guidance system for beverage consumption in the US, ranking beverages from level 1 to 6, 1 being the best option, all the way down to 6, the sugar-sweetened beverages. And where you see is tea and coffee were introduced in 2006, and they could be included in what would be considered a healthy beverage pattern. Primarily, tea and coffee are included because why? What we said before, they're very low in calorie. We're talking about without added sugar and without added creamers. So they're very low in calorie. There was some discussion of the other potential health benefits of the phenolic components and bioactive components in these beverages, but their primary motivation for being included at this stage was, hey, they're very much like water. This then, of course, translated to other guidance. There's some recommendations from the Healthy Eating Plate from Harvard Medical School, and you could see coffee and tea with little to no sugar, little milk or dairy, 1 to 2 servings a day, kind of being lumped in with water. Again, great because at least it's getting the name out there, but not so great because we're not capturing what other benefits might be there for consumers. Now, fast forward to 2020, just last year, and after a little bit of work, tea and coffee and flavored waters did make the list in terms of being now part of a healthy dietary pattern. However, it was again reiterated, coffee, tea, and flavored waters are options, but most nutrient-dense options for these beverages include little, if any, sweeteners or cream. So just keeping it in the context of that. And then, of course, caffeine. Both tea and coffee are sources of caffeine and other xanthines, but in general, keeping in the context that 400 milligrams of caffeine a day is safe, but more than that may not necessarily be optimal. So the consumption of beverages such as coffee and tea must be kept into that context where we want you to have it. It's okay as a good choice, but make sure you don't overdo it because of the caffeine. So again, nothing really positive that made it out in 2020. And again, if you look at some of the consumer side of this, cut coffee calories. These are the types of messages we're seeing, right? We're not saying drink tea or drink coffee because it contains a lot of really good things that maybe protect your heart. They're really just saying it's an okay choice as long as you don't have calories in there. And that is not necessarily the message that perhaps is best for consumers. And why not? Well, it's missing an opportunity. It's missing an opportunity to build on guidance that links these polyphenol-rich products, in particular tea, to growing evidence of physiological benefits. And I think today you've heard a lot about these benefits, in particular cognitive. You've heard about cardiovascular. You heard about cancer. And in particular, I'll talk about how maybe some of this research in alignment with cardiovascular benefits and flavanols, in particular from tea, could be used to help us navigate this guidance and develop recommendations that are really beneficial to consumers and their health. So, how do we do that? Well, currently dietary bioactive compounds like tea flavonols are not part of food-based dietary guidance. And again, just to highlight, phenolics are your big components in terms of black tea and green tea. They make up, in essence, 30 to 40% of the solids in a cup of tea. To date, the dietary guidelines have only focused on fruit and vegetable servings from the standpoint of the plant-based space. They have not really gone into these areas of bioactives. They've been mentioned. Phytochemicals have been mentioned as a beneficial part of fruit and vegetables, not so much as beverages. And there's no inclusion in dietary guidance, primarily because we don't have what's there on the right, the dietary reference intake. And in fact, I think that one right there, which is vitamin C, vitamin E, selenium, and carotenoids, might have been the last time that the IOM, back when it was the IOM, looked at dietary bioactives and antioxidants. So how are these two things related, dietary guidance and DRIs? And this is really the crux of the rest of the conversation today. So how do we start? How do we begin to translate the growing evidence base? And you've seen some evidence of that today. Here is a meta-analysis of RCTs and prospective cohorts done by Aideen and a team. Gauri Raman from Tufts, and also the study that Taylor Wallace, one of the studies he presented today on the dose-response relationship between tea consumption and risk of cardiovascular disease. So how do we translate such great evidence that is building to guidance? And by that, I mean guidance on tea consumption, but then also recommended intakes for flavantriol, which are important to develop that guidance correctly. So we actually created a working group on this. I was part of this with Penny Chris-Etherton and Connie Weaver and Elizabeth Johnson at the time. And we had published this in 2019. 2020, I believe, is when it actually came out. But it was really kind of how is the path forward in terms of really updating where the original Barry Popkin, Walt Willett guidance was. And so it was about clarifying healthy beverages, dairy and juice beyond the categories they were in, and then really beginning to consider that evolving relationship between beverages and phytonutrients, in this case, flavonoids, and long-term health benefits. When it came to tea, just to summarize, we did this for each of the categories. And when it came to phenolic-rich tea, and I put coffee in there as well, because those two are linked in many ways to this argument. They're key sources of polyphenols, and they should be considered part of a healthy dietary pattern that accounts for all the negatives that we talked about before. We mentioned brewed products must be preferred based on their strong epidemiological associations with health and the content of phenolics. That's because the majority of the research is on brewed products, and I'll mention why that's important in a second. We did also talk about it in the context of caffeine. just as it was before, to limiting caffeine intake to 400 milligrams. And that decaffeinated products can actually be good, but to know that they do have perhaps some differences in polyphenol content. So this was some recommendations that were put out by our group. And then the thought process is, how would this look if we tried to implement it? So let's go back to this notion of brewed. Why was brewed a focus of our discussion? Well, besides green and black, which you could see here on the left side of the screen, differ in chemistries, i.e. the flavan-3-all monomers become oxidized through the process of making black tea to make theaflavins and theorubicins. You see differences in profiles between green and black, and you see in brewed tea fairly high content of monomeric forms versus what you see in black tea, which is a very high content of oxidized forms. You see that decaf products tend to have lower content. This comes from the USDA database. But what we also know consumers have access to is ready-to-drink products on the shelf. And it's important that you understand that they're not the same products. They are improving vastly, but typically ready-to-drink products are formulated slightly different. And again, these are database values. It's not necessarily what's true to what's on the shelf, but they are different products than brewed, and to a certain extent, while they may be improving, don't fully represent a serving of tea without the context of how much of these flavonoids are there. So it's important not only that we recommend servings in guidance, but we think about the amount of flavonoids that are actually in these products. So there's also a lot of variation. This is a study from WHO, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, in regulatory toxicology, really, that looked at the toxicity of tea flavonoids, but really talked about the diversity of the catechin composition, the flavan-3-all composition, 32 test materials, 49 experiments and clinical trials. And you can see there's a lot of variation. And so to generalize benefits just because something is called tea needs to have some grounding based on the content of key flavan-3-all. So as we begin to translate, that's why it's important to also have values and numbers. So this is, which approach is good? We could look at food-based guidance that right now includes flavan-3-all rich foods. Right now, you only have fruits. You don't have tea. You don't have cocoa, for example, but tea is important. And I know Taylor also presented a little bit of the Cosmos study that is linked. But why is it important to have a DRI, perhaps, for something like flavan-3-alls? And it's really about, what does that tea look like? So the parallel approach to kind of develop a path, both for DRIs as well as for informing dietary guidance, is key. Placing flavan-3-alls in the context of scientists, consumers, and policymakers all on the same stage is important. It helps us set standards, enhances research and assessment, and ultimately informs product development. How do you make a better ready-to-drink tea that's actually aligned with a brewed tea? It also enhances visibility for flavan-3-alls, and I believe helps us get to dietary guidance if we actually have at least a conversation about a DRI. And ultimately, as I mentioned, it's about better translation to consumer products. We have to have targets to formulate with. So what does that look like? Considering flavan-3-alls in the current framework of US DRIs, ironically, before you think of something being beneficial, we should always think about something being dangerous. And so tolerable upper intake levels are important. Tea does have a history in research where there have been some adverse effects reported, usually from extracts and supplements, not from brewed products. And so we think about the UL, the upper intake level. And then we also think about developing something called an AI, an adequate intake, which is established when we don't have enough evidence to develop an RDA, which we do not for something like a flavan-3-all, because it's not essential, number one. So let's talk about upper intake levels. I want to go back to this paper from WHO. It was a safety of green tea and extract composition in adults, and it's a really nice systematic review. And just to sum it up, it's a pretty safe product. But there were concerns about hepatotoxicity from years ago from dietary supplement use. And even considering many of those studies, they can point out that a safe limit of intake is over 338 milligrams of EGCG in tea. When we think about what that means, ultimately, you could translate that to almost 15 cups of tea a day. Now, caffeine aside, okay, but 15 cups of tea a day from at least the polyphenol perspective are safe. So you have a pretty high level of tolerance in a brewed product. So let's think about the next thing. What is the level for something like an AI? And I don't need to go back and represent a lot of the research you've heard today. Rather, let's look at some of these meta-analyses that have been done most recently. And I just wanted to point out the one from Aideen's group, looking at cardiovascular and cardiometabolic health. You can already start seeing benefits on blood pressure at very low levels in FMD, so around less than 220 milligrams. So in all quartiles of intake, there were some benefits. 220, 400 to 600, 550 to 850, and then above 800. You could see benefits across different biomarkers and measures. Looking at the work presented by Taylor Wallace today, from 39 prospective cohort publications, you can linear meta regression showing that each cup of tea, defined at about 280 to 380 milligrams of total flavonoids for black and green tea respectively, shows benefit. Using data from these types of studies, you can already begin to model it out and think about what a good safe range would be. So if we think about overall evidence of positive effects in cardiometabolic health, you would really think about a low range of benefit being from 200 milligrams a day, maybe a little bit like a cup's worth, to a high range, like maybe 2 to 3 cups worth, 400 to 600 milligrams of flavan-3-ols, understanding the variability that you might see in flavan-3-ol content. So how are these doses achievable through diet? Well, if you followed the current dietary guidance, it would only be from 1 large apple and 2 servings of table grapes. You'd finally get up to those levels. Now, you start adding other foods that are flavan-3-ol rich, cocoa, you're going to get a large amount of flavan-3-ols, but in polymeric form, these polymeric anthocyanidins, not necessarily the monomeric forms we see from tea. What is quickly apparent is that tea becomes the #1 source, considering almost 10% of the US is consuming tea, almost the #1 source of these compounds in the US diet. And if we do follow the science on their benefits for cardiometabolic health, you would once again begin to think that at least 1 serving of these products per day, up to 2 to 3 servings, might actually be very beneficial and warrant their way into dietary guidance. But again, the key part of this is linking not only the foods or the beverages in this case, but also the amount of polyphenols, in this case flavan-3-ols from tea, that are coming in those servings. So it's kind of why we need both. We do need to communicate to consumers about what's literally on their plate, or in this case, in their cup. 4 to 5 servings of phenolic-rich foods and beverages a day would be a good place to start, right? Saying you can get these from beverages as well. Intake ranges of 400 to 700 milligrams of total phenolics, but when you think about flavan-3-ols from tea, it's probably more like 200 to 400. That's where we move to the actual DRIs. If we could get to a DRI for flavan-3-ols or for other phenolic categories, but as far as tea is concerned, flavan-3-ols, we'd be able to move that needle quite dramatically in terms of being able to make sure the products that we're recommending are in alignment with the benefits that we are observing through the science. So with that, I will stop, and I believe we turn it over for questions, correct?